This is chapter 4 of Suzanne Keen's narrative form. Uh, Chapter 4 is about character, characterization, and represented minds, people on paper. What is character but the determination of incident? What is incident but the illustration of character? Asked Henry James in his 1884 essay, The Art of Fiction. More than a century later, we can still ask the same questions when we begin thinking about the nature of fictional character in narratives. Separating plot from the characters who experience events, cause them through their actions, meditate on them, or react in one way or another, wrenches apart the two elements of fictional narrative that are most securely bound to one another. How indeed can we think about characters without discussing their actions? We can't. How can we judge a set of actions in a plot without referring to the agents we come to know through those actions? We shouldn't. This discussion thus begins with an acknowledgement that it artificially separates characters from the plot that couldn't function without them. The benefit of temporarily isolating characters from their story matrix lies in the observations that can be made about how writers build out of descriptive, illustrative, and demonstrative passages their invitations to imagine the people who populate story worlds. Some narratives emphasize character and some emphasize plot. No narrative can do without either element, though writers and critics have disagreed over which element should be given the higher priority. Furthermore, character and plot resemble one another functionally in that the reader's knowledge of both shifts and changes during the reading experience. During a first reading, details of both plot and characters are received through the narration. These details can provoke the questions that drive the desire to continue reading. After a first reading of a narrative has been completed, a reader can then reflect critically on the full story and the fully revealed characters. Both a concluded plot and a character about whom no more words exist paradoxically persist in the imagination in a way which allows rethinking, questioning, and speculation. The notorious question, how many children had Lady Macbeth, represents for several generations of critics an extreme case of the kind of question that should not be asked of a fictional character, an entity made out of a finite number of words. Yet readers who have surrendered themselves to a fictional world will almost certainly lend extra characteristics from their experience of people or of other fictional characters to the characters they have read. Arguably, the temperamental dispositions of individual readers, as well as their own identities and attitudes, shape the construction of fictional characters that occurs when readers co create story worlds during reading. Further, many narratives demand that the reader work to figure out what has happened to a character during a gap, a skip in the discourse in which plot events are implied, though not narrated. Acknowledging that readers of narrative routinely add and fill in as they reconstruct people on paper into inhabitants of fictional worlds raises challenging questions for formal analysis. How much of character can or should be attributed to formal devices? How broad a range of responses to character can be addressed within a formal analysis? Can counterfactual speculations about what characters might have done or said in extra-textual situations ever contribute to a formal discussion of character? Generations of new critical structuralist and some post-structuralist critics would have answered no. But reader response critics, genre critics, some feminists, and many practitioners of cultural studies have good reasons to move beyond the strict conception of character as purely textual. making room for reading against the grain, historically contextualized reading, and reading that acknowledges the open-endedness of interpretation requires a more flexible interpretation of character, including characters as entities which readers understand as related to people, or what Baruch Hochman calls substantial hypothetical beings. This approach to an imaginatively fleshed out fictional world and its inhabitants leads to a different kind of insight than the equally useful attention to the small textual building blocks that are put in place in a fixed order by the writer, who creates both character and plot out of words. The questions that students of narrative ask about character thus range widely. They may address the fictive personality of the character. Why is Mr. Woodhouse, Emma's father, so stingy? They may react to generic expectations. Does Thomas Hardy succeed in making Henchard a tragic hero? They may focus on external details. How does Dorothea Brooke's clothing reveal her attitudes and ideals? They may draw attention to representations of character's embodiment. How do these details shape the character's thought and actions and plot trajectories? They may emphasize conflicting responses. Why do contemporary readers find Little Nell sappy and implausible when Victorians found her believable and moving? They may focus on matters of narrative technique. Why, in July's People 1981, does Nadine Gordimer allow the reader to have access to the adult characters' minds, but not to the children's minds? They may establish criteria for success or failure on the part of a writer. Does the author invoke sympathy for the characters, or do they fail to come to life for the reader? Indeed, the response to character is so profound a part of the reading and viewing experience that some students will be content to organize most of their critical observations about a narrative around questions about its creation and use of characters. Terms. Characters. Those anthropomorphic entities who carry out the plot actions of narratives strongly resemble real people or plausible people in fantastic situations. Certainly, many narratives, from children's stories to beast fables to novels like Richard Adams' Watership Down, employ animals as characters. All of these animals open up to interpretation as human-like as soon as thoughts, feelings, speech, or motivations are attributed to them, or as soon as an artist draws them with human-like faces in comics or graphic narratives. Some of the stories in Italo Calvino's Cosmic Comics stretch the point by giving an element an unpronounceable name and putting it in situations that no human being could experience. This strategy points up the fact that science has its narratives too, whose actors and agents are then forces, elements, or entities that can be named only by formulae. As soon as one of those entities has a feeling, such as longing or a thought that implies consciousness, it becomes human-like. As theologians can attest, the avoidance of anthropomorphizing language is a demanding task. Fiction writers ordinarily accept characters' quality of seeming like human beings, even though they know as well as anybody that characters are inventions constructed out of words. Normally, readers create fictional characters in their minds by assembling the textual details relayed by the narrator into patterns that seem like people. Thus, fictional characters, and not only those in realistic texts, invite comparison with the real people of a reader's experience. When a reader judges a character believable, he or she tacitly calls up his or her knowledge of real people, or, to complicate matters, of other fictional characters in similar fictions. The following discussion of character follows a line of thought in narrative theory that urges critical readers to recognize and respect the profound difference between real people and fictional characters, even when the narratives that contain them work hard to make the reader erase that difference. Nonetheless, I acknowledge the truth of the observation that as embodied readers, we bring a level of expectation that characters and stories will correlate in some degree to our embodied experience. Indeed, readers may create versions of embodied characters out of very few cues as we project fictional worlds around characters out of sometimes quite minimal data. Artists themselves complicate the reader's understanding of characters as different from people. The standard legal statement that often appears with the publisher's information claims that any resemblance to persons living or dead is entirely coincidental. Not coincidentally, this assertion often appears in the front matter of novels filled with characters drawn from life. For instance, Emma McLaughlin in Nicola Krauss's The Nanny Diaries asserts that though the authors have worked as nannies for over 30 New York City families, none of these families is portrayed in this book. Names and characters are the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual events or persons living or dead is purely coincidental. Yet, at the same time, the novel suggests that it is dishing the dirt on a very real scene, providing an inside view of an otherwise closed world. In a delicate balancing act, novels and films marked with legal denials of responsibility for semblance can manage to convey elliptically that apparently fictional characters are based on real people. A common alternative to direct portraiture of the living can be achieved through the combination of traits from a variety of sources. A writer who acknowledges taking a way of speaking from one living person, combining it with a manner of dressing from another, or with a profession entirely made up, has employed tools of the craft to make a plausible and believable character, not a real person. The goal of such a technique may be to create a character that seems like a real person, but it may also be to use the fresh combination of traits to create the sorts of implicit problems out of which interesting plot lines develop. Character building can be one of the what if strategies used by writers to create narratives. Many writers report that in the process of creation, characters seem to take on lives of their own, and some writers speak of their characters as if they were friends or relations. Iris Murdoch indulged in this sort of imagining. Most often, writers show that they understand very well the difference between the figures of their imagination and real people. Novelist Jill Patton Walsh's response to the question, "Do you put real people in your books?" is typical. She says, "I hope the people in my books are real to you. They are real to me. Sometimes I seem to be able to hear them talking in my head. I don't make up what they say. I just listen and write it down. But they aren't portraits of people that I know in real life. You can't put actual people into books because you don't know enough about them." What seems at first glance like a paradoxical claim, you don't know enough about real people to put them in books, addresses a fundamental difference between fictional characters, the creatures E.M. Forster named Homo fictus, and actual living beings. Unlike Homo sapiens, Homo fictus possesses a mind and feelings that can be rendered accessible to readers of narrative fiction. While your friend can tell you what he was thinking, or you might guess what your mother feels from her expression, or you may read in a diary entry another's private thoughts, no living being experiences the sort of access to consciousness, including thoughts, emotions, memories, motives, and subverbal states that modern and contemporary fictional narrators routinely render up to the reader about fictional characters. The explanation of the techniques that allow narrators to generalize about, report on, quote, or narrate characters' mind stuff make a central part of this chapter. The representation of consciousness is one of the technical accomplishments that distinguishes modern narratives, especially novels, from ancient precursors such as the epic and the saga. That this technical development arises in tandem with modern notions of the individual as a discrete self who possesses rich interiority, an unconscious mind, memories, and partially recognized motivations does not mean that earlier fictional characters completely lack interiority. Just that narrative fiction before the 18th century rarely represents a sustained inside view. Certainly, the external actions and narrator's epithets for Odysseus suggest a complicated mixture of feeling, understanding, and planning, along with blind spots and failures to think ahead. A perspectivism allows generalizations about characters' thoughts, feelings, and motives without employing a center of consciousness located in a character's perspective. Narrative theorist Franz Stanzel was almost certainly correct to associate the introduction of what he called perspectivism in fictional narrative with 19th century novels. The novel provides an especially flexible means of representing an aspect of experience, living inside a mind in the company of others who themselves possess minds, that modernity foregrounds. This chapter works from the inside out, following the discussion of modes of representation of fictional consciousness, which applies to written narratives. The reader will find a discussion of other elements of characterization, most applying equally to film fiction and written texts. This, in turn, is followed by a treatment of some of the important ways that fictional characters have been categorized by critics. For example, as flat and round by function, and as types. Representing consciousness. In her book Transparent Minds, Dorrit Cohn names the three modes of representing consciousness in fictional characters. The discussion here summarizes her discussion of these modes in third-person narrative situations, both authorial and figural. See Chapter 3 for a full explanation of narrative situation. Cohn's book also describes with parallel terminology the versions of these techniques as employed in first-person narratives, but in the interest of brevity, I shall not discuss them in detail here. The three modes of representation of consciousness, psychonarration, narrated monologue, also called free indirect discourse, and quoted monologue, also called interior monologue, often coexist in a single work or even in a single passage, though the heavy reliance on one mode may be associated with a particular period or style of narrative. Modernist fiction with quoted monologue, for instance. Combinations are common. Before discovering the modulations often found in representations of characters' mind stuff, the student must first confidently identify the three modes. Psycho-narration consists of the narrator's discourse about a character's consciousness, often employed in an authorial narrative situation. Psycho-narration allows the narrator to generalize about what a character has thought about for a long time, as well as reporting in the narrator's language on the gist of characters' thoughts and feelings. Mary, a working mother, hated Neil because he had tried to shut down the daycare center. Psychonarration can be used effectively to convey what a character has not thought or felt. She forgot to call the allergist for the third day in a row. Psychonarration preserves the tense and person of the narration, smoothly following the action, the narrator's reports on external features, quoted speech, and characters' actions without any shift in the norms of the narration. All of the features of psychonarration thus described can be observed in narratives with overt external narrators. The 18th and 19th century English novelists use psychonarration generously. Psychonarration can be spread around when the narrator explains what a host of characters think or feel, but it can also be useful in figural narrative situations, for it can be used to report on subverbal states and dreams of a central consciousness, reflector. Thus, despite its association with the godlike omniscient narrator of the mainstream realist tradition, psychonarration is by no means absent from modernist, postmodernist, and other contemporary narratives. Though she is well known for her use of quoted monologue, for instance, Virginia Woolf also employs psychonarration for conveying her central character states of mind through analogies, metaphors, and images. It can also be used to represent the thoughts of groups. Alan Palmer's cognitive narratology has rehabilitated Cohn's psychonarration under the label thought report as a sophisticated and flexible technique. Palmer draws attention to variants of thought report, intramental thought or individual thinking, and intermental thought, joint group, joint group shared or collective thought. Palmer argues that intermental thought, representation of communal thinking, shows how social minds work by means of thoughts visible to other characters in fictional worlds. This externalist perspective is a useful supplement to Cohn's terms. For example, in Thomas Hardy's major fiction, the intermental thinking of groups represents social norms distributed among minor characters, observers, nosy neighbors, and members of rural choruses. It is as hard for individual characters to keep secrets from these groups as it is for them to divulge the contents of their own minds to their closest companions. Thus, Hardy infrequently employs the mode of representation of consciousness that most readily yields up the constituent words of characters' thoughts, narrated monologue. Narrated monologue, also known as free indirect discourse when it omits tagging with words such as she thought, is considered one of the most significant innovations in technique in the 19th century novel, though some critics have spotted it in earlier texts. Narrated monologue represents the character's mental discourse in the guise of the narrator's discourse. Most theorists thus consider it a double-voiced kind of discourse. In other words, reading narrated monologue gives the impression of the words and modes of expression of the character while retaining the tense and person of the narrator's language. While a narrator employing psychonarration might report of a character, she thought about calling the allergist. In narrated monologue, the same character's thought patterns might appear. She really ought to call the allergist to see about a better sunscreen for Jake. His rash was bad, worse than yesterday, and it wasn't the chlorine because they'd been at the lake. As this invented example shows, the thoughts of the character are told in language that retains the third-person reference and the basic tense of the narration. In this case, as in by far the bulk of narrative fiction, the past tense. Yet, the feel of the character's inner speech to herself comes through. Because narrated monologue retains the tense, usually past, and person, third, of the narration, it can be smoothly combined with psychonarration, sometimes even in the same sentence about a character's thoughts. The sentence of psychonarration, dread of the child's illness filled her like a dark sludge, could be combined with the narrated monologue without alteration of tense or person. She really ought to call the allergist to see about a better sunscreen for Jake. His rash was bad, worse than yesterday, and it wasn't the chlorine because they'd been swimming at the lake. Dread of his illness filled her like a dark sludge. Neither psychonarration nor thoughts rendered in narrated monologue could plausibly be spoken aloud by the character without significant revisions into present tense and first-person discourse, the standard modes for speech and dialogue. In that significant subset of contemporary narrative that employs present tense throughout, narrated monologue can still be spotted by its preservation of the third-person reference to characters. quoted monologue. By way of contrast to the other two modes, quoted monologue, by way of contrast to the other two modes, presents the character's mental discourse with or without quotation marks and tagging by shifting from the past tense of narration to present tense and from the third person of narration to the first person of thoughts. In the case of the present tense narrations, it still shifts from third person to first person narration. These thoughts, though unspoken, are written in such a way that they could plausibly be spoken aloud without violating the reader's sense of grammatical speech. Thus, the narrated monologue presented above could be converted into quoted monologue. I've got to call the allergist to see about a better sunscreen for Jake. His rash is bad, worse than yesterday, and it isn't the chlorine. We were at the lake. Note that the past tense that remains is the kind of past tense that can be used in speech about something that has happened in the character's past. The entire thought could be plausibly spoken aloud without alteration. By Cohn's nomenclature, this sort of thought is quoted, not told, as in narrated monologue. Extended passages of quoted monologue are sometimes called interior monologue or stream of consciousness. See the discussion of stream of consciousness in keywords below. Strongly associated with modernist fictional techniques under the name of interior monologue, quoted monologue, with and without tags, appears in early prose fiction, such as the narratives of Aphra Behn. In addition, quoted monologue very often appears not in the long flowing passages associated with interior monologue, but in short bursts of thought stuff that it dispenses with formal syntax entirely. Perhaps more mimetically, the quoted monologue for the concerned mother might be rendered allergist, rash worse, not water, sunscreen? Admittedly, this passage of thoughts would sound very strange spoken aloud, and it is so fragmentary as to elide most signs of tense and person, but it comes closer to quoted monologue than to either of the other modes for representation of consciousness. In some passages of rendered thoughts, the writer leaves too little syntactical or grammatical evidence for the reader confidently to decide whether the character's thoughts are quoted or mediated through a narrator. In those cases, a sense of the norms of the text, what modes of representing consciousness are most often used, can inform a reader's interpretive decision. The combinations and modulation of modes of representation of consciousness within passages containing characters' thought reward close attention. Because of the congruity of tense and person, psychonarration and narrated monologue are often combined. For instance, Joyce uses narrated monologue in the concluding passage of his story, The Dead. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. These are clearly Gabriel Conroy's thoughts, though they appear in the tense and person of the narration. Combined with the narrated monologue, however, Joyce describes Gabriel's inner state using psychonarration. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe. Quoted monologue, though more formally distinctive, also appears in combination with the other two modes. While writing handbooks often advise the aspiring fiction writer to avoid combinations and to choose consistency, and often to avoid psychonarration altogether as too much narratorial telling, 20th century fiction in a variety of genres demonstrates that combinations are common. For instance, the following passage from Virginia Woolf's story, Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, contains all three modes. First quoted monologue, then alternating phrases of psychonarration and narrated monologue, with a return to quoted monologue at the end. Poor little wretches, she sighed, and pressed forward. Oh, right under the horses' noses, you little demon. And there she was left on the curb, stretching her hand out, while Jimmy Dawes grinned on the further side. Big Ben struck the 10th, struck the 11th stroke. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Pride held her erect, handing on, acquainted with discipline and with suffering. How people suffered, how they suffered, she thought, thinking of Mrs. Foxcroft at the embassy last night, decked with jewels, eating her heart out, because that nice boy was dead, and now the old manor house, Dirtnell's van passed, must go to a cousin. Few of the rules that fiction handbooks offer are consistently observed in the wide range of published narratives. For instance, the use of a figural narrative situation with a single reflecting character would imply that the consciousness of that character alone would be represented. However, serial reflectors, yielding to one another the central perspective, or even briefly interrupting passages of thought attributed to a previously externalized character, are common in contemporary fiction. As the previous chapter suggests, writers sometimes construct novels with multiple narrative situations, alternating first-person and third-person sections, for instance. Similarly, multiple modes of representation of consciousness can be employed to dramatic effect. For those writers, by far the majority, who allow access into at least some of their characters' minds some of the time, the representation of consciousness is a powerful tool in creating believable, substantial, hypothetical beings. It should be stressed that there is nothing especially natural or inevitable about the privileging of consciousness as an aspect of characters. The treatment of character as possessing interiority is an historical phenomenon, and some commentators see the focus on represented consciousness in modern literature as a symptom of a crisis of privacy. For instance, Michael Goldman writes, "It is no accident that the terrible puzzle over self and language, persons and texts, that constitutes the post-structuralist or postmodernist moment is coeval with what appear to be the final stages of this crisis of privacy. Our radical doubts about selfhood and identity seem the inevitable product of a long history of increasingly excruciating scrutiny of inward private spaces. Analysis of represented minds may thus seem to participate in a bankrupt project of shoring up the boundaries of a self that is a delusion or a projection of wish fulfillment. It may be used to deconstruct the very notion of separable consciousness and selves. It may demonstrate, through the polyphony it traces within the verbal representation of a single mind, how thoroughly permeated by external discourses human character appears. A private inner sense of person may be shown to be the constructed projection of a number of external networks of significance. Or, as is most often the case in narrative fiction, it may assert with technical ease the human-like qualities of consciousness that mark characters as real and sympathetic to the readers who could never, in real life, gain access to another's mind. In any case, the preoccupation of modern narrative with the representation of interiority demonstrably results in an array of techniques for capturing what and how characters think.